Good morning. My name is Ronan Doorley, and I'm a research scientist with MIT City Science. And I'm going to talk to you today about proximity of homes, workplaces, and amenities. Transportation accounts for the most CO2 emissions in the US of any other single source. And we usually think about technologies such as electrification and autonomy as being the main solution to this problem. And I think that these sorts of technologies certainly can play a role. But let's first take a step back and talk about why we make so many motorized strips in the first place. The separation of residential, commercial, and industrial areas into different zones away from each other is really a modern idea that was only made possible by the advent of railways and later road networks. And this has kind of led to the autocentric sprawl that we see in so many US cities today. Whereas in cities that developed before the automobile, we tended to have much more organic growth of walkable communities. And today, there seems to be a growing recognition that, in some ways, we need to get back to living in these types of mixed-use neighborhoods with all of the amenities of daily living within walking distance. So I'd like to talk about some of the tools that we're developing in city science to model and design these walkable communities, and starting with a case study of Kendall Square. So let's start by understanding how people are currently moving in Kendall Square. So we have about 57,000 people currently commuting into Kendall Square who live somewhere else. There's about 4,000 people who live in Kendall Square and commute out to somewhere else. And then we have about 2,000 people who both live and work in Kendall Square. And these three groups have very different mobility behaviors. The people who commute into Kendall Square are driving about 9 miles per day for commuting on average, compared to about 4 miles a day for the people who are commuting out of Kendall Square, and less than 1 mile a day for the people who both live and work in Kendall Square. And this is just talking about commuting. It turns out all three of these groups actually drive more for non-commuting purposes than they do for commuting. And this is trips to restaurants, to the supermarkets, to entertainment venues, places that we call third places. Okay, so let's come back to Kent's thought experiment. What if all of these people who are currently commuting in or out of Kendall Square could instead both live and work in Kendall Square? And this is what we call live-work symmetry. Well, a simple estimation tells us that the miles driven for commuting would drop off dramatically. And if all of the amenity visits were also local to Kendall Square, then the total miles driven would similarly drop off. And now, these are obviously very extreme scenarios designed to kind of show the potential impacts of these dramatic shifts. And in order to move in this direction, there are a couple of things that we'd really need to get right. First of all, we need to make sure that we provide enough of the right types of housing for the people who currently live in Kendall, or currently work in Kendall Square, so that they can actually afford and want to live in Kendall Square. We need to provide local jobs for the people who currently live here, and we need to provide enough new amenities to support this new increase in population. So some of the other talks today are covering housing, so I'm going to focus on these other 2 points, starting with matching jobs to people. Because if we want to try to reduce commuting by providing jobs, we really need to understand what types of jobs are actually suitable for a particular population. And we can actually model the closeness in skill levels between any two jobs by using just open source data. And in this way, we can create kind of a proximity matrix of job-to-job skill similarity. And for example, we're using this type of methodology today to explore and simulate different industry development scenarios in East Palo Alto. Today, there are a lot of people who commute out of East Palo Alto, and so we're trying to see if the right mix of industries could be provided locally so that we could provide better jobs for the people who currently live there and also reduce the need for them to commute out. So by modeling and simulating the likely job-to-job transitions that would occur in any particular industry development scenario, we can actually start to understand how many of the newly created jobs could be attained by the local population versus how many would have to be filled from the outside community, which would likely lead to more commuting and potentially even displacement pressure on the local population. And we're finding that the choice of industry can have a really significant impact on this. So live-work symmetry by itself is not enough. As we saw earlier, most of the driving in Kendall Square is actually not for commuting, it's for other purposes. So we need to make sure that we also provide enough of the right types of amenities so that people don't have to use their cars for these third place trips. So one way we can get at this is first we need to understand what amenities people currently use. And one way we can get at this is to look at, observe the amenities they currently visit, regardless of where they are. So for example, this is a visualization using SafeGraph data of Kendall population visits to restaurants and other eating places. And we can do this for a range of different amenity types. and then start to calculate for each of these amenity types how many amenities we would need per capita in order to support the local population. And some of the amenity types are going to be more important than others, and this kind of depends on the stakeholders who are involved. But once we have a sense of which amenities we care about having accessible locally, we can look at any particular area and start to analyze how well it's performing. So we start with the residential population. From that, we can infer the demand for the amenities. We combine this with the road network and the locations of the amenities themselves in order to calculate how many of each amenity type are actually accessible from each residential location. And then from there, we can calculate proximity metrics for any number of different amenity types, where in this visualization, blue is indicating that there's enough of that amenity to support the local population, and red is indicating that there's some deficiency. And we can also do the same thing in 3 dimensions so that we can account for different uses on different floors of the same building, as well as 3-dimensional mobility within buildings and between buildings at multiple elevation levels. And we can also assess how any new building development would affect all of these proximity metrics, whether it's new residential, new commercial, mixed use, and so on. So clearly there's a lot of challenges involved in achieving live-work symmetry and local amenity use, but there's also a huge potential for carbon reduction if we can move in this direction, not to mention the potential for economic and social benefits of having more walkable, vibrant communities. Thank you for listening. I'll pass it over to Maitane, who's going to talk about hyper-efficient places of living.